the Bidwell House Museum is celebrating its 25th year, which for a house well over 200 years old doesn't sound very old, but for a museum to survive and indeed thrive in the middle of the woods in a tiny community in a very rural part of the country really is a huge achievement. And that achievement is due to the people who care about our local heritage, about history. It's very much due to an incredibly dedicated board of directors, and a number of them are here today. Rob Hooks, who's the president of our board, Rick Wilcox, Nancy Jones, Richard Green is here, other board members. Well, they're on a program that you are very much invited to take home. It's got some of the Bidwell story in it. It also has a listing of our members to a certain date and our corporate supporters, which help us to do the work we do as well. And it has our season program in it, so please do take one home. John Demos, of course, is a board member, and he is one of the treasures that we have here, not just at the Bidwell House, but in the Berkshires. John is a professor of history, he is an author, and he is a wonderful researcher and storyteller. And we're so lucky to have John here with us this morning, and he's going to tell us about women and men. And isn't a lot of life about women and men? I'm very curious to learn which of my preconceived notions about life among the sexes hundreds of years ago are right and which ones maybe not so much. So John, thank you for being with us.
So here we go again. Another chance for John to be in the pulpit. I still can't wait to get used to that. But, before I sort of launch in, I feel that in the last few weeks, well after I agreed with Barbara to present this talk on gender in colonial America, the whole topic of gender has been transformed in some ways. We now have Bruce Jenner turning into Caitlyn Jenner, and lots of public discussion of what gender means anyway. I think I heard somewhere that the Census Bureau is now considering a revision of its gender categories such that there may eventually be 50 possible entries on the list. Gender, that's gender today. I have to say that gender back then in the colonial era was basically thought of as a binary with just two parts, and that's basically how I'm going to approach it today. I want to say too, before I launch in, that I'm going to speak of it sort of somewhat from the women's point of view, women as the baseline for this discussion. As some of you may be aware, there's been a long movement, it goes by the name of women's history, extending back to the 1960s and 70s, and I think it's been one of the truly great changes in historical study over those years. So, whereas if I were giving this talk in 1965 or even 75, there really wouldn't have been a lot to go on. Now there's really a great deal. I'm going to do something kind of unorthodox as we start out, and that is to ask you to look at the handout that I've distributed. And I want to talk about what's here on the handout by way of sort of presenting you with two little vignettes of gender interaction in the colonial era. These are two episodes, both of which come from court records of the time. And I think they may serve to sort of open up the subject. The first of the episodes is a court case from Essex County, Massachusetts in I think the 1670s. It's a property dispute between a couple of neighbors, the Brown family and the Boynton family, and it's basically about them. They're basically at odds with each other about the ownership of a certain ox. It's kind of humble, everyday stuff. And what I'd like you to look at, and I'm going to read along here as you look, is on the printed side, not the manuscript side. We're on the printed side now. The testimony of one of the principals, Sarah Boynton, which begins sort of several lines down from the top of the page. Okay, here goes. Sarah Boynton testified that she looked out and saw Ebenezer Brown throwing down the cart ladders that stood up against the doorway where an ox of Goodman Brown's was shut up. This is evidently Ebenezer Brown's ox, but for whatever reason, he's been now in the Boynton barn. She called to him that he could not have the ox unless he brought a half bushel of corn, as her husband charged her, or else old Goodman Brown was to promise to pay it. He went in and loosed the ox, and now he switched to a direct quotation mode, in which he's speaking in the first person, in which time I set up one of the ladders, which was the foreladder of a cart, and held it up. Then he came with the ox, and pressing against the ladder, told me, "You had as good let it alone. It is not a woman that shall hinder me. I will have him do what you will." Then I charged him to go off from our ground, but he refusing, I told him, "If you will come, you must take what comes, for I will do what I can to hinder you. If you had agreed with my husband and brought a token, I would not have said anything against it." Then he said, "The token is we must give you half a bushel of corn," not saying who should do it. Then I said, "How shall I know that? For I never did know of it before." Whereupon he said, "Will you not believe me?" Then I told him I must not trust anybody but old Goodman Brown upon this account. Then he said, "My word is as good as my father's." There's actually a generational aspect of this exchange. "I am as good a man as my father, but I durst not give any credit to it." Then he said, "If you were a man as you were a woman, I would stave your brains out." Then he said, Brown being in the hovel and having thrust off the ladder at a distance from the hovel at the top, he plucked it suddenly to him and plucked it out of my hand, and throwing it suddenly from him, the uppermost slot of it struck her. He called to one of her children. She called to one of her children to prevent him from taking away the ox, and he said if he followed him, he would stave out her brains. Well, so on and so forth. Some of the details here may seem a little obscure, but the gist, I think, is clear. With this man, Ebenezer Brown, who comes to the barnyard of his neighbors, the Boyntons, and tries to take away an ox. Goodwife Boynton forbids him to take it. They disagree, obviously, about where the rights of ownership actually lie. And the matter of gender difference is directly mentioned in the course of their dispute. Goodman Brown seems especially nonplussed at being interfered with by a woman, but she is definitely sort of up to the challenge of confronting him. She says, quote, "If you will come, you must take what comes, for I will do what I can to hinder you." And then she barricades the door with a ladder and tries to ward him off. Without further comment for the moment, let's turn the document over and look at the other side for the second little episode, as it were, involving gender difference and gender interaction. This is a court case, a criminal case actually, from Connecticut in the late 1660s. As you see, it's in the manuscript original. I always think it's kind of nice thing for people to take a look at what the original records look like. I know they aren't going to be easy to decipher unless you're sort of practiced with this sort of thing. But I'll read along here again. It's the bottom third of this manuscript page that I want you to look at. Mary, the wife of John Copeland, and Abigail, the wife of John Betts, being convicted before the court for notorious lascivious practices in offering violence to Edward Hall, in pulling down his breeches, and in taking up his shirt before and behind, and pinning it over his shoulder, and with their hands clapping him on the naked back and on the naked belly, and for pulling down John Lattimore's breeches and drawers, and pulling him up and down the room by the shirt, and taking up his shirt behind and striking him behind, and for their lascivious carriages towards Sigismund rituals, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of different, but nonetheless, it is again a kind of gender, a certain kind of gender interaction. In a sense, what we see here is not simply a woman defending her interests and her family's interests against men, but women going on the attack. We probably shouldn't imagine that this is a typical case. The actions that are described here do seem kind of extreme. Still, it was not totally bizarre. I've seen at least a few other cases with a similar flavor. And I think it can be understood as sort of the outer edge of a kind of spectrum of, if I can put it this way, of conflict behavior. A spectrum which shows us a lot of women asserting themselves quite forcefully against men. Anyway, these two different episodes are, I think, sort of diagnostic about some important aspects of colonial gender relationships, and I offer them as well, just as a way to kind of begin. I'll come back to them a bit later on. Now, as I really dig into this topic in a more general way, I'm going to try to deal first with, I think, what could be called the matter of prescription. What the culture prescribed about gender, the ideals, the values, the leading attitudes and conventions. Then I'll turn to the sort of framework of actual experience that seems to have shaped the lives of the genders in the colonies. And finally, I'll take up the whole arena of sort of ground level experience. What people on both sides of the gender divide seem to have felt and done in family life, in work, in religion, and so on. Okay, prescription first. That's the easiest place to begin, actually, because here and there, people in the colonial era wrote down their basic ideas and values about gender. And it's clear that all across the pre-modern world, including colonial America, the prevailing model of women was a kind of deficit model. Women were defined by reference to men, especially by certain forms of alleged deficiency or inferiority relative to men. To put it another way, a woman was seen as being like a man, but in a kind of lesser version. She simply had less of certain key human attributes. For example, she had less physical strength. As a Puritan minister in a sermon kind of straightforwardly wrote, quote, "The masculine sex is more bold, more robust, and more strong than the female." And by the way, one imagines that these physical differences seemed especially obvious and important in a culture where physical labor was so central. But alongside the matter of relative physical weakness, colonial Americans also attributed to women certain other kinds of weakness which may have seemed even more important overall. For example, women were thought to be inherently weaker in intelligence, in their basic mental and cognitive powers. Their brains supposedly didn't work as well, especially for more complicated and abstract kinds of thinking. You can find many references to this in writings from the period. One vivid example comes from the journal of Governor John Winthrop of Massachusetts in the mid-17th century, I think. He's describing at this point the sad fate of a certain Mrs. Ann Hopkins, who was the wife of an early magistrate in New Haven. Mrs. Hopkins, Winthrop says, went beyond the boundaries of female capacity by, quote, giving herself largely to reading and writing, quote, and as a direct result, she went insane. At least. In short, she overtaxed her limited female mental powers by trying to become too much of an intellectual, and then she simply broke down. In fact, as I think of that, most colonial women could not possibly have given themselves to reading and writing because most were illiterate. We do have good data now about literacy in colonial America. The gist of it is, in a place like New England in the 17th century, something like 60 to 70% of women were illiterate, whereas only about 30% of men were. So in a sense, this is a kind of aberrant, in several senses, this is a kind of aberrant case. Furthermore, because women were considered to be weak in their powers of reason, and reason was the favorite period term for this, because of that particular deficit in their basic makeup, women were also considered to be unreliable and unsteady from an emotional standpoint. They were likely, for example, to be overtaken by sudden fits of impulse, or again, in the language of the time, of passion, quote unquote. In men, by contrast, stronger powers of reason would serve to moderate such emotional forces. And these attitudes were found not simply in the male leadership of early American communities, I mean people like Governor Winthrop. They appear also in all sorts of small everyday situations as described, for example, in court records. Here's a quick sampling of randomly selected cases. You can just kind of listen for the melody. In one case, a female convict pleads with her judge for lenient treatment because she, quote, is a weak woman. A male plaintiff in another court case is described as having asked his neighbor to, quote, come and reckon with me, but not before my wife, for it is very likely that she would rail at you, for you must consider she is only a woman, unquote. In another case, a female witness begins a kind of plea to her son, quote, if you would believe a woman, believe me. And finally, a female defendant who alleges that she has been, quote, surprised by a sudden request to sign a certain document and, quote, being a weak woman, she agreed to it. We should notice, too, that some of these comments about weak women, quote unquote, were made by women themselves. So if this was a put down, and yes, I think basically it was nonetheless internalized by some of those who were on the receiving end. And there's a further point about all this. Women's weak reason and emotional unsteadiness were linked at some level with a profound moral weakness as well. The biblical story of Adam and Eve in the garden was taken as being emblematic. Eve had been first in sin, quote unquote. She had yielded to the serpent's temptation, and then she had drawn Adam into the same wickedness. Here's a short quote from another early Puritan sermon that's pretty typical of the prevalent opinion about this whole moral aspect. Quote, for a woman is frail and liable unto all evils. A woman is a very weak vessel, and may soon deceive a man and bring him unto evil. Many examples we have in Holy Scripture. Adam had but one wife called Eve, and how soon she brought him to consent unto evil and to come to destruction. It is a very hard thing for a man to rule well over a woman. End quote. Curious kind of ambiguity here. On the one hand, a woman is described as a weak vessel. On the other hand, she, in her fallen state, assumes a paradoxical kind of power over the man. Eve easily seduces Adam from the path of righteousness. And women in general, quote, may soon deceive a man and bring him unto evil, unquote. There's a kind of backhanded recognition here of female strength, although in men's eyes at least, it's a strength that's more likely to be linked with sin and Satan than with God's own truth. Well, given this entire configuration of female weakness, which is at the same time a kind of dangerous power, it seemed appropriate and necessary to make women largely subject to the will and purposes of men. Men must guide and direct, women must follow. The prescriptive statements are unanimous about that. And the goal was to avoid danger to both parties. And I do want to emphasize the word danger. A morally weak but otherwise powerful woman was a threat to herself, to her husband, to anyone else who might cross her path. I haven't yet mentioned witchcraft in this connection. Witchcraft is one of my old stalking horses in scholarship. But I don't want to miss the opportunity to tell you. Anyway, everyone in pre-modern times understood that witches were mostly females. Actually, the formal belief system about witchcraft did not make that connection in any rigid way. A witch was simply a person, any person, who had decided to become a follower of the devil, and who in theory could be either female or male. But in practice, the vast majority of witches, as charged in court, were women. In fact, and this is what's really kind of the key, this is true in just about every culture where the belief in witchcraft is strongly held. The details may differ a whole lot between, say, witchcraft belief in present-day Africa or American Indian societies in the 18th or 19th century, and colonial society in the 17th century. But the one common feature, just about a universal feature, is that the people suspected of doing it are predominantly women. So, evidently, this is a kind of an element of misogyny, fear and hatred of women that virtually transcends any particular boundaries of historical time and space, which is to say that its presence in colonial America may not actually, it's consistent with the larger ideology of gender, but there may be a more complicated and deeper kind of underlying cause. Okay, let me just pause here in order to try to sum up this part of the story. A woman is, in these several different ways, thought to be a weaker version of a man, physically, mentally, morally weaker. She is, if I can put it this way, quantitatively less. She has lesser quantities of each of these fundamental human capacities. She doesn't lack them altogether, she just has less. And if we look ahead to the next phase of history, of gender history, in say, the 19th century, we see, I think, a striking change that makes for a kind of clarifying contrast. Because in that later period, the 19th century, gender difference is no longer defined in quantitative terms, but rather in qualitative ones. At that point, men and women come to be seen as having wholly different qualities. Men are worldly, women are spiritual. Men are active, women are passive. Men are sexual, women are passionless, as they said. And so this is a very different way of setting things up, and I think it helps us to grasp the colonial way if we do make the comparison with what came later on. Now, all that I've said so far about gender prescription relates to the essential character typically attributed to women. But prescription is also about roles. not just what kind of creature she is, but also what she could and should properly do. And the key word in that connection for pre-modern folks was helpmeet, or as we would probably say it, helpmate. An early New England poet, who was also a minister, gave a fulsome description of his recently deceased wife, which serves quite nicely to express the ideal here. He wrote, quote, "As wife, a tender, loving, meek, patient, humble, modest, faithful, sweet, endearing help she was, whose choicest treasure she held to be her husband's pleasure." Unquote. This model woman, like all model women of that time and place, is defined by her readiness to please and to help others, and above all, to help her husband. She is self-sacrificing in a sense, and even, I guess you might say, self-denying. Yet if you look hard at all those adjectives, none of them quite means passive. And if you go beyond broad generalizations to consider the specific day-to-day content of women's role in early America, you quickly come to see an expectation of much energy and activity. The center of that role was being the mistress of a household. And the term mistress carried with it a real sense of being active and strongly engaged. Housewifery in pre-modern culture was for sure a many-sided, all-encompassing thing. To sort of sum it up quickly, it included food preparation, first of all. Men never cooked. That was entirely a woman's job. And the hearth was the center point of women's experience, and fire tending was a specifically female expertise. Housewifery also included washing and cleaning and several forms of in-home production, textile making, candle making, basket weaving, and things like that. It also took in the care of domestic animals, milking, for example, and the tending of a family garden plot. It included a certain amount of looking after the sick. Most medical care in colonial America was home care, and the woman of the house was expected to be very knowledgeable, well, more knowledgeable anyway, about health and illness than anyone else around. She would have learned about herbs and potions and other kind of home remedies from other women, starting probably when she was a child from her own mother. Physicians could be called in for extreme medical emergencies, and they would be men. But for more ordinary cases, women's know-how was expected to be enough. Then, too, there was child care. But here, interestingly enough, women were supposed to share responsibility with their husbands. In fact, men should be the leaders in child rearing, because women were seen as being too emotional and impulsive to show good judgment about the needs and interests of their children. The typical child-rearing advice from the period is full of warnings about the danger that women may spoil their kids. And it's interesting, too, that the intended audience for this advice, I'm talking about sermons, pamphlet literature, that sort of thing, the intended audience was fathers, not mothers. Fathers would be, in that sense anyway, the primary parent. Mothers would for sure have to play a significant role, but all in all, theirs would be a secondary, almost a subordinate part. Also, and for the same reason, if a marriage broke up, didn't happen very often, but once in a while, custody of the children was assumed to belong to the father. Finally, and still on this matter of a woman's prescribed role, there were some things which took her away from her home and hearth and beyond the bounds of housewifery proper. There were activities in which she was directly assisting her husband, representing him in court, for example, if for one reason or another he was away. or helping him to manage a tavern, or to run a small shop, or some other business enterprise. Or even at harvest time, going out into the fields to participate in the gathering of the crops. One leading scholar of colonial women's lives summarizes this whole point about a colonial woman's role with the term deputy husband. And that does seem to capture it pretty well. She could be his deputy, his second in command, his representative. She could stand in for him when he wasn't there and do what he would have done under the same circumstances. Even Goodwife Boynton's action in that case with which we started, the one in the barnyard there about the ox, even she, in forcibly resisting Ebenezer Brown when he tried to take the ox away, she was acting as a deputy husband. Quote, she called to him that he could not have the ox unless he brought a half a bushel of corn, as her husband charged her. In short, she was following her husband's wishes in this matter and doing as he would have done had he been there in person. Another way of trying to conceive of women's role and men's too in this connection. Well, think of it this way. Out here on one end of a kind of continuum is nature. All the stuff like trees and plants and soil and animals and so on. And over here at the other end of the continuum is culture. The way humans, both then and now, manage to have a usable world. In between lies a process whereby nature is transformed into culture. This process, nature to culture, is enormously complex in our own time, but in the pre-modern era, including colonial America, it was a whole lot simpler, and it was more or less uniform, the same, since everyone basically did some kind of subsistence farming. You can diagram it spatially with the forest and open fields at the nature end of the continuum and the farmer's house at the other end. In between, literally in between, is the barn where cattle and other domestic animals are kept. You might even divide the house in two and make it sort of join the continuum. At the back end of the house is the kitchen and other workspaces. At the front end is the parlor, where finished goods are stored and displayed, and where the inhabitants of the house can live a fully cultured life. Are you with me so far? What's important here is the process of transformation. Again, from nature to culture. For vegetable foods, this means raw wheat at one end of the continuum, turned into baked bread at the other. For clothing, it means raw flax into linen shirts and trousers. For meats, it could mean pigs taken from foraging in the forest and ending up as roast ham on the table. Now, basically, in every case for colonial America, the process had two parts. One was what the colonists themselves called breaking. That is, breaking the materials involved out of their natural state, gathering and threshing the wheat, cutting and separating the flax, slaughtering and dressing the pigs. And this was almost exclusively the work of men. But once they've been broken, the materials had to be processed in additional ways in order to become ready for actual use, which is to say, to become part of what I've called culture. The threshed wheat had to be converted into flour and then kneaded and baked in an oven so as to get finished loaves. The fibers of flax had to be cleaned and spun and woven into cloth and finally cut and fitted to one or another human body. And the dressed meat had to be prepared for the fire, skewered, marinated, roasted. This second set of tasks was what colonists invariably referred to as improving. and it was exclusively the work of women. So again, breaking by the men, followed by improving by the women. These were their own terms, and they were very clear about the difference. Put the two together, and you've made the journey from nature to culture. I brought along a couple of objects to sort of symbolize all of this. I think you can see them. Here's the things about this pot is how heavy it is. You can imagine women lifting this thing around the fireplace. This is a very early, I'm quite sure, 17th century cook pot. Just give us what it is. And here is a hewing axe, also I think 17th century, which a man would have used to sort of, as the second part of the process of turning a tree into a usable piece of lumber. It's basically you stand on top of the fallen tree and you square it up by trimming off the sides on four sides. Improving for women, breaking for men. And if you're very Freudian, now, this little exercise that I've done here in the last few minutes may seem somewhat abstract, but the reason for going through it is to get a fuller sense of both the difference and also the complementarity of men's and women's work. They could see both aspects, different but very complementary. It was visible and palpable to them, literally from one day and 1 hour to the next. And I think that's so different from our own lives, right? Our work lives, male and female, they don't correspond to any, either to the same kind of difference or to the same kind of complementarity. The only complementary thing is when, talking a two-career couple, they both put the money in the bank at the end of the month or whenever, but nothing like this. And furthermore, I think this kind of schematic presentation highlights the centrality of women's particular contribution. Otherwise, we might fall into the error of imagining farming as men's essential work, and housewifery as just a kind of support service that women gave to their men. In fact, housewifery was at the center of the whole sequence. And women were literally at the center. They did the crucial work of improving, of turning the broken materials into finished goods. Their performance of this work was absolutely crucial. If they didn't do it right, all the prior work of men would be wasted. And arguably, I think, their position in the middle could produce a special kind of pressure and tension. There are a couple of studies of insanity, mental illness, as we would say, derangement, as they would have said in the colonial era, suggesting much higher rates for colonial era women than for men. Many more women driven over the edge, so to speak. And perhaps, just perhaps, this might have something to do with the highly charged and pressured position of women as improvers in the nature to culture transformation. Okay, now I'll try to turn from the somewhat more abstract considerations to the actual experience of women under these conditions. Suppose we, in effect, sort of just go looking for women in the major record sets from the time. Suppose we ask, where do women mainly turn up? And what do we typically find them doing? Let's start with politics and governance, the different agencies of local and provincial governance. Well, I think you know the answer to that one probably already. We cannot find any women active in governance, not certainly in New England town meetings or in comparable bodies in other parts of the colonies, Pennsylvania, New York, and so forth and so on. Nowhere, in short, nowhere in the American colonies could women vote, in any regular way or hold public office or otherwise participate in governance. What about religious life, the churches? There, women certainly had a presence, but mostly, I think, as silent partners, because they had no real voice in church affairs. Church officers were always men, whether we mean the deacons in New England churches or the elders in the Reformed churches of the Middle Colonies, and the same is true further south. So when a particular congregation had to hire a new minister or to take action to discipline one of its own members or even to admit a new member, the people who made the decisions were all men. However, there's one important qualifier to mention here, a kind of cross-current running against this traditional principle of male dominance in religious life. Protestant Christianity, and especially the various branches of Puritanism, including Quakerism, stressed the equality of human souls before God, all souls, female as well as male. And this equality principle was a kind of entering wedge for women to become gradually more active in organized religious activity than they had usually been in an earlier era. Pennsylvania provides a particularly striking example of that, where from an early stage, Quaker women would hold their own monthly meetings apart from the men with their own agenda, their own internal disciplinary organization, their own proceedings, and so on. And that was also true. There were some Quaker groups that operated the same way here in New England. But otherwise in New England, we don't find so much in the way of gender-specific religious groupings, but we do see, interestingly enough, we do see individual women beginning to move out front in one or another specific cause. The most famous single case of this, I think, is Anne Hutchinson of Massachusetts. As you may know, she led a major challenge to the church hierarchy in Boston in the mid-1630s. And there are also some other famous female rebels, so to speak, in early New England religious life, most of them Quaker and Baptist sympathizers who tried, in short, to buck the male Puritan establishment. And in all of these cases, I think, the women involved took encouragement from the Protestant doctrine of equality of souls. What about the law, the court system? Here, women were generally subordinate to their menfolk, but they did appear. They were a presence to some extent. When they were married, their property rights were entirely subsumed under the rights of their husbands. But if they were widowed, they had what was called a customary claim to about a third of their late husband's estate. Historians have been wondering and arguing about the meaning of this. Was the so-called widow's third a way of recognizing women's specific and important contribution to building up an estate, or was it simply a kind of dole, a welfare arrangement to keep them from becoming a public charge? Unclear, actually, how best to interpret that. Daughters could certainly inherit property, but usually not land or housing. Instead, they got various kinds of personal property, usually in smaller amounts than would have been true for sons. In general, then, the picture of men and women in the law is rather mixed. Women could, of course, be prosecuted for criminal offenses, most often, as it happened, for some type of sexual misconduct, fornication, bastardy, and once in a while, adultery. They could also be witnesses in all kinds of court cases. And through their husbands, they could be involved in various forms of civil proceedings for debt, trespass, breach of contract, or whatever. Often, too, they were appointed by local courts to serve as estate administrators and executors when their husbands died. Furthermore, in most places, the courts tried to maintain a single standard of punishment, the same for women as for men in criminal cases like fornication, adultery, and witchcraft. And the courts also offered the protection of the law to women who were physically abused by their husbands. All of this seems to add up to a picture, well, not perhaps of true gender equality, but at least of something that was, I think, was better on the whole than had been the situation for women before the law in the mother country, in old England. I'm getting near the end of my time, but I do want to just flag the whole issue of change over time. I think one of the great mistakes we often make in thinking about early America is imagining it as a kind of static thing, a backdrop to all of the dramatic changes that came afterward in the 19th and 20th and now the 21st century. But after all, we're talking about a period, the colonial era, which is 170 years or so long, depending on the account. And over that time, for sure, some things were changing that had important effects on the gender, the whole system of gender relations. One thing that happened, and I'm just going to give you the headlines here, sort of in the area of family and household life, was a growing trend over time to move from women, seeing women as mainly bearers of children, to seeing women as rearers of children. In fact, the whole idea of child rearing, the notion that the child had a soul that was worth special attention, worth saving, tended over time to elevate the whole sphere of child rearing. And women's connection to that became increasingly central. At the same time, in the sphere of work life, men's and women's lives were being separated. Men were more and more going into the world of commerce, and at the end of the colonial period, even early kinds of industrial production, taken away from the household. So women are left increasingly in charge, and all that points ahead to what became known in the 19th century as the separate spheres of women and men. It would be very wrong, I think, to read back the separate spheres idea into the colonial era, but nonetheless, towards the end of the colonial era, things are definitely moving in that direction. Well, there's no way to pull all these different strands together in some kind of overall summation, so let me leave you with a couple of brief, absolutely concluding thoughts. I haven't mentioned the word patriarchalism yet. There have been several times when I've been on the verge, I think. But it's out there, and we do have to recognize that the fact that male leadership, male dominance, especially in all sorts of official decision-making, was a kind of bedrock principle of pre-modern life. Virtually no one challenged that principle, at least not directly. Even famous women rebels, quote-unquote, like Anne Hutchinson, tried somehow to square their positions with the idea of male dominance. Yet patriarchalism did not mean servility for women. In many ways, you could say it was a kind of flexible thing in terms of actual practice. A situation, in short, where women moved quite freely among the various different sectors of colonial life and asserted themselves quite forcefully when conditions called for such forcefulness. And that maybe leads back to the term I flagged earlier on deputy husband. It's the deputy part that especially captures the ambiguity here. As deputies, women were not finally in charge. They followed someone else, a husband, a man, who was their leader and who had ultimately had the decisive say. But deputies were not mere servants either. They had real responsibilities and some authority too, especially when the leader was absent. It may not sound great from the standpoint of 21st century feminist values, But I think we could easily miss the complexity, and we could underestimate the elements of scope and opportunity for women if we approached all this from a present-minded standpoint. That's it. Thank you. Glad to hear comments and questions from anybody. Yes, Nancy.
John, when you were talking about the continuum, nature to culture, and you were describing some of the tasks of women, and I was thinking of Reverend Bidwell's wives. Now, we didn't talk about class and its impact on women's role, but I've always been curious, would Reverend Bidwell's wives, would they have had help in some of these tasks?
Yes, I think, I can't remember what we know about the Bidwell household in that regard, but a minister's household, I think, on more cases than not, would have had one or two servant girls, quote unquote, living in the house for a period of years maybe and helping out, for sure. But supervising the servant girls would in fact then become another part of the mistress of the household's responsibilities. So, I mean, I think it sort of all fitted in.
Thank you.
Sure. Adrian.
In terms of breaking to finishing, it would be the men, would it not, who broke the wood, built the home, and the furniture within it.
Yeah.
So on that particular line, which is an important one, toward the culture of the home,
Yeah.
the women would not have the finishing tasks. They would not be building furniture
Well,
or
that's
beds.
true. That's true.
Yeah.
Once you've got to set things up, and there, I guess, the men are out front all the way. Would they have? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to say it.
Okay.
But once things got going, I think the separation was pretty clear to everybody. Yeah.
How did inheritance work, and what would happen with the land?
I can't. I'm sorry.
Excuse me. How did inheritance work, and what would happen with the land in a family that only had daughters?
What would happen in a family that only had daughters? I have to say, first of all, that would be an extremely rare case. The average size of family in colonial America was 8, 9, 10 kids on average. So the possibility, it's not impossible, but they would be very, very, very rare, I think. If it happened, I think things would be divided up among the daughters. I mean, I actually can't remember ever seeing a specific case of that sort. The typical case was a mix of sons and daughters, and there was a different pattern in each case. The sons basically, as I said, I guess got the land and the housing. The daughters would get furnishings and textiles and a whole variety of other things that might help them to set up an improvable operation on their own after they marry. Yeah.
You know, when I read the cases, you know, one of them strikes me, it could be right out of Chaucer, right? The Citius Women, the other, the Merry Wives of Windsor.
Okay.
You know, as you know, the deficit model goes back before Augustine and at least up to Henry Higgins. Why can't a woman be more like a man? So, you know, I guess my question is, what do you see as specifically colonial about it, or is it that a frontier society allowed more flexibility, to use your word?
Yeah. What do I see as specifically colonial? A lot of it is not very specifically colonial. There's speak of pre-modern culture, pre-modern life, and it has many similarities across a lot of time and space. We could talk a little bit, in a little bit more specific way, about the influence of frontier conditions, quote unquote, and most historians of women especially would argue that these tended to favor elevating the role and responsibilities of women. A kind of raw situation in which survival itself was really at stake, and everybody had to contribute, and that certainly included the women of the household. Another way of talking about the colonial situation might be by way of demography. At least in the very earliest stages, there was a seriously skewed sex ratio, many more males than females. Actually, less so in New England. Further south, like in Virginia and so on, there was a huge, huge difference. Under those conditions, in a sense, women's contribution was at a premium. So it seemed, and some historians of colonial Virginia, for instance, have made the argument that women there moved up in the world, in a sense, more rapidly than perhaps was true almost anywhere else at the same time. So demography, ecology, economic system, all those things do play in. But the deficit model, as you rightly said, is inherited from way back. Okay, that's about what I can say. Yeah.
Why was New England more sexually balanced than the South?
New Englander immigrants or migrants into New England tended to come as families. That's why. Whereas further south, for different reasons, they tended to be singles, young single people in Virginia and Maryland, for instance. So there's where you would get, I mean, it'd be mostly young men who would sign up to go on board and go across. Yeah.
In line with that, thinking of David Hackett Fisher's work, Albion Seed,
Yeah.
in which he talks about how much of the cultures of the North, Middle States, and the South differed because they came from different cultural backgrounds in England.
Yeah.
And that's some of the
Okay. Yeah, that's, he's referring to an important book some years back by David Hackett Fisher, my old colleague and close friend. I'm not sure what to say. I mean, there were regional traditions in England which had some impact on the nature of settlement in different parts of colonial America, for sure. When I argued about these matters with David, I guess essentially I felt like he overestimated. I don't know how to say it. I think there's something to what he says, but you get the feeling in that book of all really separate streams, yielding very separate ways of life. Although there were indeed separate ways of life, I don't think it was all a matter of sort of demographics and coming from different parts of England. I can't remember whether he has in the book any special argument about gender in that connection. I just can't recall.
somewhat, but
Okay. Yeah.
Did the role of the wife change if her husband passed away?
Well, that's a good point. And there certainly were a fair number of widows around colonial America, right, colonial New England in particular. And it's hard to say. Certainly, at least in the immediate aftermath of a spousal death, husband's death, the woman was in a very different spot, the woman, the widow. But my sense is that she would immediately reach out to men to whom she was connected, brothers, brothers-in-law, and it would be a kind of extended family response, I think, to the death of a husband and man. But the second thing to say is that rates of remarriage were very high and very fast in colonial America. So a widowed woman, in fact, it was likely to be within months, and maybe even weeks, in a few cases I've seen, being courted by someone else, often a widower himself. So these reconstituted households of widows and widowers would immediately kind of set up the same pattern, I think, that had existed before the death. I can't remember if I've seen figures about this, but I would venture to guess that a majority of widows and widowers were remarried within a year of a spouse's death. The idea of a household that was run by one person, either male or female, partly because of this whole nature to culture process that I was talking about, that was not good from their point of view.
The whole idea of the complementary roles that you talk about seems a little bit at odds to me with this deficit model that women were just less.
It does to me too. And I thought about it all over again as I was looking through these notes beforehand. And you know, I don't know what to say, except that first of all, ideology and practice are often not totally of a piece. That's, I think, one point which we could develop in many different contexts. And secondly, the deficit model, as I tried to emphasize, doesn't say that women are completely different or have none of the qualities necessary to do good things in life. It just says they have less. Where the problem comes is that when you really take hold of the centrality of all the different things that women have to do by way of quote-unquote improving, whatever they've got is evidently enough to do that. But, you know, I hear your question, and I have to candidly say that I think there's an issue right there. Yeah.
Do you think that discord between those two concepts is why that by the time you get to the 19th century, women are attributed with these better qualities than men in certain aspects? Do you think that evolved?
One thing I didn't have a chance to mention, because I was sort of shortening things because of time, was the nature of women's participation in church as time went along. If you had visited a New England church, maybe even this church, I'm wondering now about Bidwell's church, in 1750, I guess he didn't get started until 1754, is that right? Well, anyway, around then, if you had visited any church, the first thing you have noticed as you walked in was a much greater presence of women. Men seemed to kind of just drift away from the church, especially in the 18th century. There are many more female members. To be a member of a church, you had to go through a certain kinds of spiritual test. But even in terms of presence in the church, people who actually came in there on Sundays, it seems clear that by the middle of the 18th century, women were the predominant group. And this is part of the way in which the old idea of the dangerous woman, the Eve-like woman, is transformed and really turned on its head. So that by the 19th century, women are considered to be better than men spiritually and religiously. Men have a kind of corruption almost at the core of their being. So, but I think a lot of that has to do with this changing demographic of church participation in the 18th century. That itself is a question which is hard to answer. Why did men fall by the wayside to the extent that they did? I really don't have an answer to that.
John, could you clarify, one of the things I'm a little confused about is a woman's recognized role in the rearing of children. The way you described it is that it was actually in the man's domain. Is that because the man was responsible for the education of the child or the actual rearing? I can't imagine that the society...
The man was certainly more responsible from the beginning for the education. If there was homeschooling, as there was in many ways for quite a long time, it was mainly the man who would be in charge. And that, again, reflects different literacy rates and so forth and so on. You know, it's hard to say sort of on the ground to what extent women actually, you know, were really involved in rearing the children. But trying to pull two things together here, the whole idea of rearing, as opposed to simply bearing, gains prominence and salience in the 18th century. So, and men are at that same point, in terms of work relationships, being moved out of the household more and more. So the women are the ones who are on the scene. Rearing is becoming more and more important, and the two things kind of converge to create a process, which leads, I think, as I briefly alluded, to the separate spheres idea of the 19th century.
But the enormous effort of getting a newborn to even school age, I'm assuming, was the woman's domain. It might not have been recorded that way because the women weren't the recorders.
Yeah, absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I think that's right. I think the first few years were mainly women's responsibility in child rearing. And in fact, it's interesting that young people, toddlers, very young children, were not differentiated very much, male versus female. They wore the same clothes, both sexes. Little boys, little girls wore a kind of long robe. Then came the crucial moment, age 5, 6, 7, maybe when boys were breeched. That is to say, put into trousers, no longer wearing these feminine-like garments. And then I think they really begin to move into the sphere of the men. And my sense is that even girls of a slightly older age, although they were continuing to work around the house with their mothers, when important child-rearing decisions came along, maybe shall we send this one to school? The men would basically make the decision. And I've just always been so struck by this advice literature, which, in contrast to what came later, is clearly directed to the fathers. They're the ones who really got to be out front in setting the standards of child rearing. Yeah.
I think it also has to do with the shift of who holds moral authority within the household.
You're good.
That it begins with the father
Absolutely.
as the spiritual leader of the household,
Absolutely.
and thus responsible for making decisions regarding the children.
I couldn't have said it better. Thank you.
Eventually moving to women
Yeah.
being seen as
Yeah.
found to
Yeah.
morality.
Thank you. Exactly so. Well, maybe we're done.